I am staring at a photograph of Lindsey Halligan, and I cannot stop thinking about one thing. This woman, for weeks, kept signing her name to federal court documents, kept calling herself the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia, kept filing motions and indictments even after a federal judge told her she had no legal authority to do any of it. And here's what terrifies me about this story. It's not just about one incompetent lawyer who got in over her head. It's about what happens when an entire presidential administration decides that laws, courts, and the Constitution itself are just suggestions they can ignore whenever it is inconvenient. Let me be clear right up front. This is my analysis. I could be wrong about some of this, but I've spent 3 days reading through 1,200 comments from people across the political spectrum, and I've found something that I think changes how we need to understand what just happened. So stick with me, because what I'm about to show you connects to something much bigger than one failed appointment. Lindsey Halligan finally surrendered. After 2 federal judges, including one appointed by Donald Trump himself, told her she was unlawfully appointed and needed to stop pretending to be the United States Attorney, she finally stopped. But here's the thing that nobody is talking about. The damage is already done, and I mean that literally. Let me walk you through what actually happened here because the timeline matters. Donald Trump, through his Attorney General Pam Bondi, tried to install Halligan as the interim United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia. Now, if you're not familiar with how this works, there is a very specific legal process for appointing federal prosecutors. It is not complicated. The president nominates someone, the Senate confirms them, and that person becomes the United States Attorney. Pretty straightforward, right? But Trump and Bondi decided they didn't want to follow that process. They didn't want to deal with Senate confirmation. They didn't want to go through the blue slip tradition where senators from the relevant state get to weigh in on who is going to be the top federal law enforcement official in their state. So they found what they thought was a loophole. They tried to use a provision that allows for temporary interim appointments. Here's where it gets interesting. A federal judge, Judge Curry, looked at this appointment and said essentially, no, this doesn't work. You can just bypass the normal appointment process like this. Halligan was unlawfully appointed. She has no legal authority to act as United States Attorney. Now, in a normal administration, that would be the end of the story. A federal judge says your appointment is unlawful, you step down, you apologize for the confusion, and you move on. But this is not a normal administration. Instead of accepting the court's ruling, Halligan kept going. She kept signing documents. She kept filing motions. She kept calling herself the United States Attorney. And here's what really gets me. She tried to indict James Comey. You remember James Comey, right? The former FBI director who Trump fired, who wrote a book about Trump, who has been a thorn in Trump's side for years. Halligan tried to get a grand jury to indict him. They said no. So she tried again with a second grand jury. They also said no. 2 separate grand juries looked at whatever evidence she presented and said, we are not indicting this guy. She also went after Letitia James, the New York Attorney General, who has been investigating Trump's business dealings. Again, trying to use the power of the federal government to go after Trump as perceived enemies. Let me pause here because I want to acknowledge something. About 40% of the comments I read were from people who said some version of, good, these people deserve to be investigated. Comey and James are corrupt. Trump is just fighting back against a weaponized justice system. And I want to take that argument seriously for a minute because it's important. The most compelling version of this argument goes something like this. For years, Trump and his supporters believe he has been targeted by politically motivated investigations. The Russia investigation, the Mueller probe, 2 impeachments, multiple indictments. From this perspective, Trump is simply fighting fire with fire. If they can weaponize the justice system against him, why can't he do the same thing back to them? I actually understand the emotional logic of that argument. I do. If you genuinely believe that Trump has been unfairly persecuted, then yeah, it probably feels satisfying to see him punch back. But here's why I think that argument falls apart. 2 grand juries, made up of regular citizens, looked at Halligan's evidence against Comey and said no. That not political bias, that not the deep state, that just regular people looking at the evidence and deciding it doesn't meet the standard for criminal charges, and more importantly, the way Halligan went about this violated the law. A federal judge said she had no authority, and she kept going anyway. That not fighting back against a weaponized system, that just ignoring the law. Now here's where the story gets even more disturbing. After Judge Curry ruled that Halligan was unlawfully appointed, she still didn't stop. So the case ended up in front of another judge, Judge Novak. And here's the detail that made me sit up straight. Judge Novak is a Trump appointee. This is not some radical leftist Obama judge. This is someone Donald Trump himself put on the bench. And Judge Novak looked at what Halligan was doing and basically said, "What the hell are you doing?" He issued an order striking her name from court pleadings and threatening to refer her for disciplinary proceedings if she kept misrepresenting herself as the United States attorney. A Trump judge telling a Trump appointee to stop breaking the law. Let that sink in for a second. This wasn't partisan. This wasn't the deep state. This was a judge appointed by the same president who appointed Halligan, telling her she was out of line. And even then, even after 2 federal judges told her to stop, Bondi and the Department of Justice kept defending her. They put out press releases talking about how brave and courageous Halligan was, how she was being targeted by political opponents, how she was just trying to do her job. I read one comment that really stuck with me. Someone wrote, "They replaying pretend, and they so committed to the pretend that they willing to burn everything down to keep pretending." And I think that captures something essential about what we just witnessed, because here, yes, what I think is really happening, and I want to be careful here because I am speculating based on patterns I am seeing, but I think this is bigger than just one incompetent appointment. I believe Trump and his team are systematically testing how far they can push the boundaries of law and precedent. They re-seeing what they can get away with. Think about it. They appoint someone who is clearly unqualified and unlawfully appointed. Federal judges tell them to stop. They keep going. They issue press releases attacking the judges. They frame it as political persecution. And then, only when they absolutely have no choice, when the alternative is disbarment and contempt charges, they finally back down. But they don't apologize. They don't acknowledge they were wrong. Instead, Bondi puts out a statement saying Halligan showed courage and conviction for ignoring federal judges and breaking the law. Now, let me tell you what I discovered in the comments that I think is the most important insight here. About 38% of commenters from across the political spectrum focused on one specific thing: the normalization of lawlessness. People from different political perspectives, with different views on Trump, all expressing the same basic fear. We rewatching the rules break down in real time, and nobody with the power to stop it seems willing to do so. One person wrote something that broke my heart. They said, "I am a federal employee. I've served under 5 different presidents, and I've never been more afraid for our system of government." Another person who identified as a conservative who voted for Trump in 2016 wrote, "I didn't sign up for this. I wanted tax cuts and deregulation, not a president who thinks he S above the law." And here, the thing that keeps me up at night. Halligan is just one appointment, just one person in one position. But the pattern is everywhere. Pete Hegseth at Defense, Kash Patel at FBI. People who are manifestly unqualified, who have publicly stated their intention to use their positions to go after Trump's enemies, who view the law as an obstacle to be overcome rather than a framework to operate within. Let me shift gears for a second and talk about something that I think gets lost in all the outrage and the daily chaos: the blue slip process. Stay with me, because this is actually important and it connects to something bigger. The blue slip is a Senate tradition where senators from a state get to weigh in on judicial and prosecutorial appointments in their state. It's not in the Constitution. It's not a law. It's a tradition. And traditions in government matter because they repart of the informal rules that make the whole system work. Trump and Bondi tried to bypass the blue slip process by using this interim appointment mechanism. And when I read the comments, I found a really interesting divide. Some people said, good, the blue slip process is outdated and lets individual senators obstruct appointments. Other people said, no, this is exactly why we have these traditions, to prevent presidents from installing loyalists without any oversight. And I think both sides have a point. The blue slip process can be abused, but it also serves a real purpose. It ensures that the people with the most knowledge about local conditions, the senators from that state, have some input into who is going to be the top federal law enforcement official there. But here's what I think is the deeper issue. When you start breaking traditions, when you start finding loopholes and workarounds, you are not just bending the rules, you are changing the nature of the system itself. Because the next president and the one after that, they are going to look at what you did and say, well, if Trump could do it, why can't we? This is what lawyers call the slippery slope, and I know that it's a cliche, but it's a cliche because it's true. Once you establish that presidents can bypass Senate confirmation for major appointments, you've fundamentally altered the balance of power between the executive and legislative branches. Now, let me address something that I know some of you are thinking. You're probably saying, Ben, or whoever else reading this, you're being hysterical. This is just one appointment that didn't work out. Trump backed down. The system held. What is the big deal? And I hear that. I do. And maybe you're right. Maybe I'm overreacting. But let me tell you why I don't think I am. The damage from Halligan's tenure, even though it was brief and even though she ultimately stepped down, is real. She filed motions. She tried to get indictments. She represented herself as having authority she didn't have. And even though the courts ultimately stopped her, think about the resources that were wasted. Think about the people who were targeted. Think about the precedent that was set. James Comey, whatever you think of him, had to deal with the stress and the expense of being targeted for indictment by a federal prosecutor. Letitia James, same thing. And yes, the grand juries didn't indict them, but they still had to go through that process. They still had to hire lawyers and prepare and worry. And more broadly, think about what this does to the rule of law. When senior government officials can just ignore court orders and keep operating as if they have authority they don't have, what message does that send? What does it tell other people in government about what's acceptable? I read a comment from someone who said they work in law enforcement, and they wrote, if I did what Halligan did, if I kept exercising authority after a court told me I didn't have it, I'd be fired and probably charged with a crime. And they rewrite. There's a double standard here. Regular people, regular government employees, they don't get to ignore court orders. But apparently, if you were connected to Trump, if you are willing to do his bidding, you get chance after chance after chance. Let me tell you about something else I found in the comments that I think is crucial. Multiple people, and I am talking about people from different political backgrounds, mentioned the Epstein files. Now, you might be wondering, what does Epstein have to do with Halligan? And the answer is, directly, nothing. But indirectly, everything. Because here's the pattern people are seeing. Trump and his allies will use the justice system aggressively to go after their political enemies. They'll try to indict Comey. They'll try to indict Letitia James. They'll threaten journalists and critics and whistleblowers. But when it comes to actually releasing information that might implicate powerful people in serious crimes, suddenly they are not so interested in transparency and accountability. The Epstein files are still under wraps. We still don't know the full extent of who was involved in that network. We still don't have answers for the families of the victims. But we do have 2 failed attempts to indict James Comey based on evidence so thin that grand juries wouldn't even touch it. And I think that contrast between the aggressive pursuit of political enemies and the protection of actual powerful criminals, that's what is driving a lot of the anger and frustration I am seeing in these comments. Now, let me be very clear about something. I don't know what's in the Epstein files. I don't know who's implicated. I am not going to speculate about specific individuals, but I do think it is fair to ask why this administration, which claims to be so tough on crime and so committed to rooting out corruption, seems singularly uninterested in one of the most significant criminal cases of our time. Okay, I want to shift back to Halligan specifically because there is one more dimension to this story that I think is important: the role of Pam Bondi. Bondi is the Attorney General. She is the person who is supposed to be in charge of the Department of Justice. She is supposed to ensure that federal prosecutors follow the law and uphold the Constitution. And what did she do when Halligan was unlawfully appointed and kept operating after judges told her to stop? She defended her. She put out press releases praising her courage and conviction. Think about what that means. The Attorney General of the United States, the top law enforcement official in the country, publicly backing someone who was violating court orders. Not quietly, not behind closed doors, but in public statements to the press. And I keep coming back to this question. What happens next time? What happens when the next Trump appointee decides to ignore a court order? What happens when the next prosecutor decides that the law doesn't apply to them because they are serving a higher purpose, which is loyalty to Donald Trump? Because that's what this is really about. It is not about whether Comey or Letitia James deserve to be investigated. It is about whether we are going to have a system where the law applies equally to everyone, or whether we are going to have a system where loyalty to the president is the only thing that matters. I read a comment that really crystallized this for me. Someone wrote, "In a dictatorship, the law is whatever the dictator says it is. In a democracy, the law is supposed to be above everyone, including the president. And we are watching in real time the transition from one system to the other. Now, I want to be careful here. I don't think Trump is literally a dictator. I don't think we are living in a full-blown authoritarian state. But I do think we are seeing authoritarian tactics being normalized. And that should terrify anyone who cares about democracy, regardless of their political affiliation. Let me tell you what gives me hope, though. Because it's not all doom and gloom. The courts held. 2 federal judges, including one appointed by Trump himself, looked at what Halligan was doing and said, no, that's significant. That means the system still has some resilience. The grand juries held. Twice, regular citizens looked at politically motivated indictments and said, no. That's also significant. It means that even in a polarized environment, when you put ordinary people in a room and ask them to look at the evidence, they can still tell the difference between a legitimate case and a political hit job. And Halligan eventually stepped down. Yes, it took too long. Yes, she should have done it immediately, but she did ultimately step down. That means there are still consequences for breaking the law, even if those consequences are delayed and insufficient. But here's what worries me. It shouldn't have gotten this far. We shouldn't need federal judges to issue multiple orders telling a prosecutor to stop breaking the law. We shouldn't need the threat of disbarment to get someone to follow a court order. In a functioning system, the Attorney General would have stepped in immediately and said, we made a mistake, Halligan is stepping down, we apologize to the court, but that's not what happened. Instead, we got weeks of defiance, press releases attacking the judges, and attempts to frame this as political persecution. And only when there was absolutely no other option, only when the alternative was disbarment and contempt charges, only then did they finally back down. And even then, they didn't admit they were wrong. Even then, they praised Halligan for her courage. Even then, they blamed the system for being rigged against them. So where does this leave us? I think it leaves us at a really dangerous moment, because the message that Trump and his team are sending is clear. We're going to push boundaries. We're going to test limits. We're going to see how far we can go. And if we get pushed back, we'll retreat, but we won't apologize, and we'll try again somewhere else. This is what some commenters called the salami slicing tactic. You don't try to overthrow the system all at once. You take it apart piece by piece. You push a little bit here, test the boundaries there, normalize something that would have been unthinkable a few years ago. And the thing about salami slicing is that each individual slice seems small, just one appointment, just one court order ignored, just one norm violated. But when you add them all up, when you look at the cumulative effect, you realize that you've fundamentally changed the system. I want to read you something that a Danish commenter wrote because I think it offers an important perspective. They said, we've watched this pattern before in Europe. A leader comes to power promising to fight corruption and drain the swamp. They start by attacking institutions they claim are biased against them. They install loyalists in key positions. They ignore court rulings they don't like. And before you know it, you don't have an independent judiciary anymore. You don't have a professional civil service anymore. You just have people who are loyal to the leader. Now, I am not saying we are at that point yet. I am not saying we are going to become Hungary or Turkey or Russia. But I am saying that the warning signs are there, and we need to pay attention to them. Here's what I think we need to do. And I am going to give you multiple levels of action because not everyone can do everything, but everyone can do something. First, pay attention. Don T, let this become normal. Don T, let yourself get numb to stories like Halligan S. Every time you see an appointee ignoring a court order, every time you see the Attorney General defending lawlessness, every time you see the president attacking judges for following the law, notice it. Call it out. Second, contact your representatives. I know it feels pointless sometimes. I know it feels like they don't listen, but they do pay attention to constituent contacts, especially when they get a lot of them about the same issue. Call your senators, call your House member, tell them you expect them to push back against executive overreach. Tell them you expect them to defend the independence of the judiciary. Third, support the institutions that are pushing back. The courts need our support. Not blind support, they are not perfect, but they need to know that we value judicial independence. Bar associations that are filing ethics complaints against lawyers like Halligan need our support. Journalists who are covering these stories need our support. Fourth, and this is the big one, vote. The 2026 midterms are coming. Every House seat is up. A third of the Senate is up. Your vote matters. And if you don't like what you are seeing from this administration, if you don't like the normalization of lawlessness, then vote for people who will provide a check on executive power. And finally, talk to people. Talk to your friends, your family, your neighbors. Not in a preachy way, not in a way that makes them defensive, but in a way that invites conversation. Ask them what they think about stories like Halligan-S. Ask them whether they are comfortable with appointees ignoring court orders. Ask them where they think the line is between fighting back against a rigged system and just breaking the law. Because here is what I have learned from reading 1,200 comments. People across the political spectrum are worried. They might not agree on everything. They might not agree on Trump or Biden or policies. But a lot of people, more than you might think, are worried about what happens when we stop following rules. And that's the conversation we need to be having, not the tribal conversation where it's just us versus them, but the bigger conversation about what kind of country we want to be. Do we want to be a country where the law applies equally to everyone, or do we want to be a country where power is the only thing that matters? I know which kind of country I want to live in. I want to live in a country where federal judges can rule against the president without fear, where prosecutors follow the law even when it's inconvenient, where traditions and norms and unwritten rules still mean something. Maybe I am naive. Maybe that country only ever existed in civics textbooks and never in reality. But I still think it's worth fighting for. I still think it matters whether we try to live up to our ideals, even if we fall short. And I'll tell you why. Because the alternative is too depressing to accept. The alternative is a country where everything is transactional, where loyalty is the only currency that matters, where the law is just a weapon to be used against your enemies and a shield to protect your friends. I don't want to live in that country, and I don't think you do either. So yeah, Lindsey Halligan finally stepped down. That's a small victory. But the war for the soul of this country, the war over whether we're going to be a nation of laws or a nation of men, that war is far from over. And we all have a role to play in how it turns out. I'm going to keep covering these stories. I'm going to keep calling out lawlessness when I see it, regardless of which party is doing it. I'm going to keep believing that institutions matter, that norms matter, that the Constitution matters. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm fighting a battle that's already lost, but I don't think so. I think there are enough people who still care, who still believe, who still think that America can be better than this. The question is whether we're willing to fight for it. So here's my ask. Don't get numb. Don't tune out. Don't let exhaustion and cynicism win. Keep paying attention. Keep speaking up. Keep demanding better from the people we elect, because if we don't, if we just accept that this is how things are now, then we've already lost.